my name is Sarah Tran. I am a community consultant, and one of the roles, the hats that I get to wear is as the capacity building consultant for communities of opportunity. And I'm very honored and feel very privileged to be able to be in this space with all of you this afternoon. I know that things are very busy right now, and also in many ways hard and heavy in the world and in our communities. So I really want to thank you for making the time and the energy and the space to come together today to really lean into a conversation around, how do we support staff wellness within our organizations and the critical and important work that you do within community. And so with that, I will pass it over to Jody Nishioka to kick us off with introductions, and then let's go from Jody to Uyang to then Derek.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for having me. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm really excited to have this conversation about wellness and staff and how we implement it. It's a big part of my job, and I'm really excited about talking to all of you about it. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm currently at the BIPOC Executive Directors Coalition of Washington, formerly at Communities Rise, which is a capacity building org in Seattle and Washington State.
Thanks, Jody. Uyang?
Hi, it's great to be here with all of y'all today, and I'm really excited to share and also collaborate in this space on how we can prioritize and center wellness in our work. I forgot my name, but my name is Wynn, and I'm currently work at RBC. Previously, I was also a fellow with one of our initial program with the Community Impacts Fellowship. And then now I'm the General Operations Manager here at RBC, and I use she, they pronouns. Yeah, I'm excited to share more with y'all.
Thanks so much, Uyang. Derek?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Derek. I use he, him pronouns, and I am a community organizing program manager at API Chaya. And we're an organization based in Seattle that supports survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking in immigrant communities, BIPOC communities, and beyond. And I'm excited to fill in for my coworker today, Kalaya, who isn't feeling too well. And so it's an honor and pleasure to be in discussion with you all around wellness today. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks so much, Derek. And I love that someone already chimed in with "We love API Chaya" in the chat. So I also love API Chaya. I love all of the organizations that we have the privilege to be in space with today. So I actually would love to invite all the folks who are with us today in this workshop outside of the panelists to introduce yourself in the chat if possible. Share your name, your organization, your pronouns, if you would like to share those. And, one thing that brought you here today, why did you choose to make time and energy for this conversation? And my apologies for us being unable to actually have you unmute and share out loud. I didn't realize this was going to be a webinar format. And so that changed our way of navigating this conversation a little bit, but nonetheless, I have no doubt that we'll still be able to engage and converse with one another. So please add in your name, your pronoun, your organization, and what brought you here today into the chat. So we have Jody from A Supportive Community for All, she, her. Glad to be here because it's just such an important topic. Thanks so much, Jody. Really happy to have you here. Kathleen with Inclusive Data. I made time for this conversation because on top of research and capacity building, we are organizers. Yes, organizers need to fight burnout. Absolutely. And Kathleen goes by she and Aya. And Cetris, who's with hip hop, is green. is interested in finding out ways to support staff in respect to health and wellness. Thank you. And Kimmy and Demethea, if you have a chance, would love for you to put your intro into the chat when you can. We're really glad to have each of you here. And we have other folks who were signed up for this panel as well. So hoping that they'll be able to hop in soon. In the meantime, though, I would love to jump into some of the questions for our panelists that we prepared for today. And as we go through these questions, I really want to encourage you all to feel free to also chime in with a follow-up question if something that a panelist shares resonates with you or provokes a thought for you that you want to hear our panelists speak to, because they really are each such incredible organizers and leaders and work within organizations in our community that I think are really just setting such an inspiring example of how we can continue to grow our commitment and our practice of wellness within our work for justice. So with that, I would love to start us off by asking each of our wonderful panelists, what inspired or compelled you and your organization to make staff wellness a core priority? Derek, do you want to start?
Sure, I can take a gander at this question. Sustainability is one of our core values at API Chaya. And so when I think of sustainability in regards to the work that we do in serving survivors of domestic violence, sexual and human trafficking, I think about what it means for our staff members, all the people in our organization, and even this movement to be sustained so that we can continue supporting survivors in our communities. Many of our staff are survivors themselves of violence. Many of our staff come from generations of that have experienced genocide and war and displacement. And so when we're in this work, a lot gets activated, right? How can it not be activated when you companion someone else in their suffering, as someone who has suffered, and finds suffering in our ancestry? I think a lot can be activated, like epigenetically, right, in our bones, in our cells, in our muscles. And so I think about, what does it take for our movements to continue our struggle, and what does it mean for a struggle to bring us closer together? So I also have been thinking about wellness, especially as it is one of our guiding values. And so that, I guess, to answer your question, our values inspire us, I feel, to bring wellness at the center of our work. Sustainability is really important for us at API Chaya.
That piece, that core tenet around sustainability and how so many of us, we come from the communities that we work in, right? And the ways that impacts us as well as it shapes us and inspires us and guides us, I think is so real and so visceral and embodied, just like you talked about, Derek. And I really appreciate you sharing all those pieces. Wing, would you mind sharing about you and RBC?
Yeah, I feel like I resonate a lot with what Derek just shared. And for us, I think giving some context to RVCU is helpful because we work with communities of color as well as leader of colors in the hopes that they are, stepping into their inherent wisdom and their leadership in transforming our community. So that means for us to work with primarily communities of color, and also all of our staff are folks of color as well. So in order to create that thriving culture and for us to really hone in on our values of equity, there's integrity, community action, and transformation, all of that has to do with wellness. So we really do need to commit to that in order to be transformative at the organization and challenge and move away from white supremacy culture. And that oftentimes that romanticizes burnout and perfectionism, urgency, and we know how that has disproportionately impact communities of color. So it's structural by design, and it continues to impact us in our bodies, and we hold that like chronically in our in the health disparities that we see in our communities as well. So we really have to recognize that if we are to be successful with working with communities of color and focusing and tending to their needs. And, like you said earlier, a lot of the times we saw that our staff are also involved in mobilizing outside of the work that they currently do at RVC. So that means like we really need to tend to supporting them in that area to, in other fronts, working towards a liberatory world. So I think that's why it feels like it really is a collective practice, and whether that's like something that we support within our work and also support or encourage others to like continue that practice outside of this space, it really does like it really aligns with all of our values and to center that wellness and joy in our work.
Thank you so much. Jody?
Yeah, I appreciate both Derek and Uyen setting the frame of the foundation of generational trauma that many of us, if we're people of color in this work, in this world, we have that, whatever it might be. And then the systemic and institutionalized white supremacy policies or practices that we find ourselves in the sector. That's a good framework. I feel like for what started off, so the BIPOC ED Coalition is relatively new. We sort of formed together in 2020. And even before that, those of us who were involved in the BIPOC ED Coalition, had been talking, other EDs and folks had been talking in the community and been part of other initiatives. And we were seeing that a lot of our colleagues were leaving the sector because they were burnt out, because they were underpaid, because, all of those things. And already this is before COVID, and this has been happening for a while. And we're concerned that how are we going to keep moving and building power in our communities and having, transformation for our communities if our leaders are leaving. So we were seeing that before COVID. And then when COVID happened, the BIPOC ED Coalition, the four of us, myself, Victoria Santos from Young Women Empowered, Andrea Calpain-Sanderson from Bird Bar, and Ananda, who was at the time at RVC, and myself, I was at Communities Rise. We were talking and we were hearing from all of us are capacity builders at some level. So we have relationships with lots of other executive directors and other leaders of color. And we were talking about during COVID, how we were hearing from folks that they were really, really stressed out, being asked to step up. The communities needed them, step up and do more with less. They weren't getting the funding, as well as getting sick, whether it be from COVID or just stress, build COVID on top of the stress that people were already having. And so we called an emergency meeting. This is how we formed the BIPOC ED Coalition. And it's relevant because at the meeting, we didn't have an agenda. We just said, we know we're all stressed at this moment in 2020 during COVID. What can we do? What are you experiencing, and what can we do together? And the number one thing, two things came up. One is we need more resources for BIPOC-led initiatives and organizations. But wellness was the second thing. And we had 200 people respond to our call. We had actually 150 people on the call and another 50 people who couldn't make it but said they were interested. And it just was very loud and clear from the leaders themselves, BIPOC leaders across the state of Washington, that wellness was a priority because we were seeing our colleagues get sick, and we're concerned that we're not going to be able to sustain this work, particularly in this time. And I know that's another question that might come up later around this particular time coming out of COVID, where we're all tired and all of the heaviness and intensity around the murder of George Floyd and the racial awakening after that. And then now with other things going on in the world, that's really heavy. So all of that, my inspiration came from the community, from seeing it from way before COVID, and being concerned about the wellness and being concerned about sustainability. And then when we called the coalition together, 150 people on the call, that just rose right to the top. And so just from a practical perspective, I'll appreciate the framework that my colleagues have set up, but from a practical perspective, they just named it, 150 people on the call, that was their top concern. So that's what's inspired us to really look at wellness more deeply.
Thank you so much, Jody. As I'm listening to each of you, something that was coming up for me is, as we continue to experience these compounding traumas and oppressions, I mean, in some ways it's nothing new, right? Particularly as communities of color and other marginalized communities, to be impacted by systems of oppression, but the ways in which that manifests, right? And the ways in which that impacts our culture and society, and the way that we relate with one another, and the way that we feel inside of our bodies and in our spirits and in our orientation to the work. I'm curious how the last couple of years with the pandemic, with the racial justice uprisings, and even in the past month, right, with what is happening in Israel and Palestine and the genocide. I know that for me, it has been an incredibly hard time. And I am curious, how has it been showing up in your organizations, within your teams and staff? And, how is it impacting maybe some of the needs that are coming up that you're hearing about, or some of the policies or practices that you may be considering or experimenting with, or leaning even further into or adapting? And any of the three of you who wants to go first would love for someone to kick it off.
Well, I can start by saying that when we were in COVID, and the fear, it's almost like I'm forgetting, but because we're in such a different place right now. But when it first came, we were all very fearful about getting sick, and what does it even look like if we are sick? Are we going to die? People were dying, etc. And then with the the racial uprisings that were happening due to the police brutality, the many cases that were happening at the time, I know that it took a huge toll on my staff at the time. It was at Communities Rise, and all of us collectively. It was just like this huge weight, and we were not only navigating the heaviness of what was happening right in our communities, but in our own homes. Our elders, concerned about our elders being ill, homeschooling our children. And then many of, folks, brown and Black folks, were, reliving the trauma that they've had generationally through what we were seeing on the news and happening in our communities. So it was really, really heavy and really, really hard. And we made space for talking about it, for giving grace to each other, for just trying to manage everything. We had a couple of additional mental health days that we gave staff to say, just take off a couple of days extra. It doesn't matter, like it's not going to affect your pay if you need it. And and then we started to look more closely at some of our benefits in terms of mental health benefits, and how we can support staff. So I would say that those things, and even now, continue to really be weighty. And we just try to give space and grace for folks. One of the things that we've done here at BIPOC ED Coalition, in the last month or two, is to spend some time debriefing about what's going on if we want to, naming it, as well as just taking some moments of silence together when we start a meeting, because we come in with all of this stuff that we might have just read on the internet or heard, as well as all the other stuff that's going on in our lives. And it's hard to stay present. And so doing some active practices where we come in together and we just say, let's just do some breath work together to get us present in the moment, to be able to do the work that we still need to continue to do, but do it in a way that just acknowledges all of the stuff that we're going through, and doing a practice that helps calm our nervous system, doing some breath work, and then being present. So those are a couple of things.
Thanks so much, Jody. I definitely saw Wing and Derek nodding to some of those things. So I'm curious what's coming up for both of you and your organizations.
Yeah, thank you, Jody, for sharing. When you mentioned the fear during the height of COVID, it really brought me back to so many of those emotions that we were collectively feeling. And you mentioned something earlier, like, oh, you almost forgot. You know, it's so strange to think about that time in the present. But then there are moments in a day where you sit and you reflect and you remember all of what has happened. And so I think even being in just being in this conversation, as I'm speaking, I'm also just remembering all the things that has happened, transpired these last 3 to 4 years. You know, certainly the fear was there for our staff, and for many of our communities, and isolation too. I think isolation was a really big piece, especially as we were, you know, all online, all virtual. And then not only the isolation piece, but then seeing the police brutality, the responses to that, the COVID deaths. I think it made a lot of people feel really hopeless and helpless, right? There wasn't a lot of places to move together and to be connected. And so, you know, when the first COVID case broke out, our organizing team was just about to launch our annual vigil every year. And every year we put on a vigil to commemorate and to honor lives that have been ended to domestic and sexual violence. Our history at API Chai is rooted in a murder, a DV-related murder that happened in the early 1990s, and several murders, that DV-related murders that happened in the early 1990s. And so usually, you know, during springtime, we come together to honor those lives, but we weren't able to because COVID stopped and paused all of that. But one thing we did do was decide to turn our programming inward and create a space internally for staff to come together around our grief, to express what was happening on our hearts. You know, aside from doing management here at API Chai, I'm also a grief counselor at Children's Hospital. So I decided to kind of hold these spaces at API Chai where we were able to express what was on our heart in relationship to our grief. We also invited a community member named Sasha Nelson, who's an occupational therapist. So we created like these grieving circles where people were able to express their fears and their thoughts around the deaths that we were experiencing, but also the separation from community members, right? It wasn't just like the literal deaths, but it was also the separation from community as well. And so during the time that we would usually organize for a vigil, for our annual vigil, we open that space internally for staff wellness, kind of doing like maybe every other week grief gatherings. And so I really appreciated our leadership team for allowing us to open that space up, because a lot of, I think staff really needed that space to connect. And there's so much about grief in our communities, I think, that is left unsaid because of the histories that we've already so much survived And so it surfaced a lot, and it allowed for us to kind of transform our grief into interconnectedness, allowed for us to kind of transform our sense of loss and bring us together to that. Um, felt like a really meaningful space to be in during that time.
Uh, thank you for that, Jody and Derek. Am, yeah, I'm feeling the heaviness in my body, even as we're talking about what has come up for our communities and for ourselves during those moments. And so during the pandemic, I was actually a fellow with RBC. And our fellowship program is basically like a 2-year cohort where you're able to like connect with like other fellows and also work at a community-based organization. And I'll speak to this as both like what I know as a staff member at RBC and also like being someone in the community in connection with RBC. It was very different because we were moving from like during COVID, we were moving from like basically like gatherings in person and like building community together constantly to a totally virtual gathering. And during that time, I saw what RVC was trying to do in order to support both like the fellows as well as their staff navigate through the times of hardship and just really being responsive to the needs of the community that they're upholding themselves to. So when like unfortunately when they saw that like because of COVID there were people experiencing a lot of loss in their close communities, their families, we were able to like really just think about like how can we take a pause and really emphasize rest and care for folks that we're working with. So they started creating like a COVID policy for sick leave that is like in addition to PTO days. So gave folks like 10 additional COVID leave days so that they can take care and utilize those time to tend to their own health. And then as well as a extended bereavement policy. Because previously we really didn't have a bereavement policy. So thinking about like time for them to take care and also incorporating funds to support folks in emergency situations. And those are some things that I saw. And also like when it comes to the mental toll that it was taking with staff and still being able to show up in the workspace, really thinking through like what does a hybrid work environment looks like. And we're still doing hybrid work actually now because it has been working out really well for us to allow folks to like work from home while and optionally go into the office for like group gatherings. So when we were thinking about like hybrid work and how do we really like emphasize wellness in that work, it was really hard to think about because like you're already in a meeting room like the most of the day when you're working. Like do you really want to go into another meeting room in like even if it's in the purpose of wellness? And like thinking about that where it's like like really having to like have space and time to talk about it with each other and in some ways compromise. So we did end up doing a lot of like virtual gatherings that included like some somatics work together, where we had a somatic coach work with our fellowship team, and then they also did this with the staff, where we were just like being able to like be in tune with our bodies and like listening to what they were feeling and working through the emotions of what was coming up for everyone. And we also hosted like virtual wellness series that I think it was in 2020. Yeah, I think it was 2020 where we we're working with, I think it was actually with Communities Rise, where we're working with like a series of like workshops and consultants where they provided like a variety of things like visual and writing, movement, creating like goals and exercises to ground the mind and body through like African dance practices. So really like thinking through a variety of way and options that could work for folks, that wasn't just like being in a meeting room and talking about wellness. So like incorporating different series of activities that folks can participate in. Yeah, and I think really like during outside of COVID, like and during the current protests in order to acknowledge the freedom and work towards freedom for Palestine, we were working on an annual fundraising strategy recently and an annual report, and we were like, this doesn't seem appropriate for us to be launching this right now. I think we really need to be okay with taking a pause when it needs to happen and really focus in on what, how can we be in solidarity with folks who are impacted by, like, and be in international solidarity with folks who are impacted by imperialism and genocide. So yeah, I think part of that is really just being okay with taking a pause on whatever work and projects that we're working on and reshifting our priorities.
Thank you for that, each of you. You know, I was definitely hearing some shared themes across what you were talking about in terms of, first and foremost, acknowledging grief, right? Instead of doing what so much of Western society often encourages, which is to ignore it, right? For it to be taboo and to not talk about it, to hide from it, to instead acknowledge and make space and breath for loss, for grief, for the ways that it is real and impacting us and impacting those we love and work with and organize alongside. And yes, I mean, Derek, your background and expertise as a grief counselor and also your lived experience and so many things that I think has brought such richness to the API Chaya team is such an asset. And I wanted, knowing each of your organizations, I actually wanted to pull out a couple more things that I happen to know about that your organizations do, but that our other folks here might not. I'm curious, Derek, if you could share a little bit more also around the transformative justice kind of internal work that the API Chaya team does, that not everyone has to participate to, but always seems like an open invitation for folks to really lean into, you know, practicing those skills and cultivating that space, which I think is also tied into wellness. But would love your take on that. That might just be my perspective.
Sure. I think this is one of the questions I really wish Clyde was here to answer, but I can take a stab at it. You know, I think it was maybe 4 years ago, transformative justice was a part of our strategic priority. And so we have built a culture at API Chaya where we encourage folks to think about, what does justice look like outside of the systems? What does justice look like outside of what we're trained to seek accountability on? And so we have hosted several internal discussions and continue to do so around transformative justice. We do have a community solutions organizing position here that works with communities around how do they seek answers to the violence that we experience in our lives that are outside kind of like the traditional or expected options that we seek in the transformative and the systems that oppress us. And so, yeah, I would say that I would probably defer to Kalio for this, but definitely transformative justice has been at the center of a lot of our work at API Chaya, and yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that.
No, that's really helpful. And yeah, certainly we can reach out to Kalio, who's also with API Chaya folks, but couldn't be here today, to get more information about that. But I was always really struck by it because I feel like when we talk about wellness, right, it's also how do we define wellness? And so much of what I'm hearing and what each of you are talking about is our relationships to one another, right? So how we relate to one another and how we hold space with one another around grief. Also, how we hold space around conflict, right? And trauma and um, harm when it happens, how we try to return to right relationship. I mean, I think all those pieces are a part of wellness as well. And sometimes maybe not what immediately occurs, right? When we think about that. And yet there are such incredible examples within each of your organizations about different, practices, resources or policies that you each have intentionally carved out time, commitment, and resources for, right? And I think that's incredibly inspiring. And I'm hoping that it also inspires some ideas for folks who are listening to each of your stories right now. I was curious for you, Wing, and RVC. You had mentioned earlier, I think something about funds to support folks in emergency situations. Did I hear that correctly? Can you speak a little bit more about that one? Because I didn't even realize that RVC had something around that and would love to know what that is or
Yeah.
things connected to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's something that we're, still getting feedback from staff on to develop, but there's always going to be things that are feeling emergent, and there's emergency situations that can happen that can prevent folks from showing up in the workplace fully, or just like taking care of themselves, and that can be related to themselves or family members or close communities. So we are currently working through like a process to support building that into our strategic budget. Right now, we're actually in budget revision season. So that's one of the things that, aside from just currently we have like $100 to support like groceries and funds for people who are taking bereavement. But in addition to that, like, what if a situation comes up where someone is like ill or like out of the office and needing to take time off, or like just really need additional support outside of just the current benefits that it's already offered. So for us, like really it's just building in that budget to support that emerging needs, and really thinking about like seeing patterns in previous years of like how many staff members do we have and how do we calculate and embed that into our budget so that it is something that we can support folks with.
That's so helpful. Thank you so much. I love bringing up and surfacing these different examples because I think it helps to illustrate just the spectrum, right, of different types of supports that organizations can create to address and respond to different aspects of wellness. And I'm really curious, Jody, for you and the BIPOC ED Coalition. Sorry, my pups always seem to know when I'm unmuted. Uh, Jody, if you could share a little bit more about both your sabbaticals policy and really core body of work, but also the work that you brought in Leticia Nieto to do with your community and network of EDs across the state.
Yeah, so I'll talk about the sabbaticals we have at the BIPOC ED Coalition, since wellness is one of our top priorities, program areas identified by the coalition of what they needed. We actually have a spectrum of rest programs that we're starting to see more holistically, but the sabbaticals are anchor program. It's grants to nonprofit organizations with leaders who have worked there for at least 5 years. And it's a program that allows a leader to take 3 months off, completely not working. And the grant provides is $60,000. So it gives supposed to cover at least a portion or all of the salary and benefits for the leader while they're away, right? Because they're not working, and but we don't want them to, they wouldn't be able to take leave if they didn't still have their money to pay their monthly, their rent and their everything else. And we don't want, of course, their healthcare benefits to be interrupted. So it's supposed to cover that. It also covers additional funds are given to cover stipends for staff who step up and cover who take on additional responsibility for when the leader leaves on their sabbatical, or if the organization feels they don't have somebody and they need to hire an interim support, people to come in to help in the short term. And then finally, we provide coaching for 30 hours of coaching for the leader and the organization to prepare for the sabbatical. So what we don't want is the sabbatical to, negatively impact the organization. So we want to make sure that the organization is ready and that the leader is ready and that they're prepared for the leader to be away for 3 months. So we provide coaching to come up with a sabbatical plan, to support the team who's still there if they need additional support while the leader is on sabbatical, and then also for reentry. So it's a holistic program that's 3 months. We also have given 1 month respite grants or 1 week respite grants. In the future, I think we're going to go to 2 weeks. And then finally, we're doing we've just did our first fall retreat. It's a rest retreat for BIPOC leaders to come. We took 26 leaders across the state to Sleeping Lady Retreat Center. We had some activities, but everything was by choice. If you just needed time to rest or be by yourself or go for a walk or whatever you needed, you did that. And so it provided a space for people to come together and have connection with each other. We had our meals together. We had some activities together, things like yoga and meditation and some healing work. Or you could use that time. So it's a whole spectrum of rest and restoration, rejuvenation for our leaders that we're offering. So that's the program. In terms of our organization, we also, so Dr. Nieto, for some of you who may not know her, she's a trained therapist, but she's also a racial equity, organizational development consultant who works with organizations on a variety of needs. I've used her in many different ways, but we have brought her in to do some work with the coalition as part of our wellness program is also bringing in wellness experts who can help with particular types of modalities, similar to the program that Uyen spoke with, that they did with Communities Rise. And so Leticia came in and did I think it was a 3-part series that just worked on doing surfacing some healing work for the coalition. But another thing that's one of our policies that we do is we have Leticia come in to help us as staff. So she's a coach. She's also an executive coach. And so we bring her in to have her somewhat like on retainer, not so much as an individual therapist, but as things come up in our work, whether it be between each other or, what's going on in the world and how is that impacting me as I try to do this work, we can call on her individually or as a group to just tap her for support. And that's one of the wellness policies or benefits that we offer here, is to have her on retainer for staff to use in whatever way is helpful. So that's one of the things, that we do with Leticia.
That's incredibly helpful, Jody. And it actually leads me to the next question that I wanted to pose to the three of you, which is, so as we're talking about wellness, right? And all the ways that staff within our organizations are impacted as human beings in this world and in this work. I know that in my own experience, both when I was an executive director, certainly in my work coaching, and working with many different organizations now, certainly conversations I've had with different organizations within the COO network, that there is so much happening, oftentimes simultaneously, in our communities, in our individual families, in the world, that the different types of needs and impacts that folks are experiencing and are coming with can be enormous, right? And varied. And something that I have been challenged with in the past, as well as have seen many leaders and organizations be challenged with, is how do we balance our commitment to supporting our staff in terms of their wellness in the ways that we can, while also recognizing that no one individual nor any one organization can be the be all end all to meet every single need. And I see nods from the three of you. So I am hoping that this resonates. And I know I've had some conversations with some of you about this as well. And I'm just curious, as we've been going through these last couple of years, how have you been trying to navigate that balance, right? Like you were talking about, Jody, there's bringing in Dr. Leticia Nieto to kind of provide support to each of you as leaders within your organization, but also not to be your individual therapist in that particular capacity or in that space, right? There's a differentiation there. And so I'm curious, and I'm sure some of this resonates with you, Derek, being a therapist as well, alongside an organizer and a program manager and all the things that I know that you are and do. Like, how do you draw those healthy boundaries, right? Connect folks to other resources so that they're not reliant on only the organization, right, as the sole place to receive support. And Uyang, I would love to hear how this comes up for you and RBC as well, if it resonates at all. It may or may not fall within your organizations or your experience. But yeah, anybody who feels ready to respond to that would really love your wisdom and take and insights on this question.
I really appreciate this question, Sarah. It's one that I grapple with often. I mean, aside from like my professional titles, I'm also someone just like who wants to be there for somebody, you know? And sometimes it can be difficult when I'm still finding out my own personal boundaries on how to help people, right? Like, yes, I'm here as a manager. I have a background in counseling, but I'm also a person like from these communities that are represented with my staff members. And so I want to make sure that each of my staff members are well so they can continue to show up for the communities that we serve. I think that begs to ask myself, like, am I well? You know, what are the things that I need so I can continue to be boundaried and continue to be sustained and do this work? So it's a question that I'm consistently asking myself as I do this work. How do I draw in healthy boundaries? How do I continue to resource my staff so they can empower themselves and be accountable to themselves as well? And I think self-accountability is something that we've been talking about at APHI for a while. Can we be accountable to our own health so that we can continue to show up for others? So I'm pretty open with staff around like, if you want to sit down and like map out who your resources are, like map out the 5 people that got your back, let's do that. You know, let's think about the resources that you do have and build them there. I feel like so many people on staff have a wealth of like knowledge around resourcing our survivors in our communities. And I think as much as we do that, we try to pour into our staff as well, whether that's like a therapist list or a list of BIPOC somatic practitioners, resourcing our staff members so they can make the decisions for themselves to be sustained in this work. Something that I didn't mention earlier is that we also have a wellness pod at API Chaya that meets pretty regularly to talk about different functions and events that we can put together to bring community connection, to bring joy and movement, silly times, time for laughter, time for connection, time for healing. We also have contracted similar to what Joey was saying, folks outside who do trauma stewardship to come to be with the staff too. Sometimes it really makes a difference moving someone outside of your regular staff. Bless you. Somebody outside of somebody outside of who they see every day, to come in and share their knowledge with them. And so we try to resource staff as much as possible so they can make the empowered decision for themselves to be accountable to their health. And as a manager, I think for me, I'm always checking in to make sure that I'm being boundaried so I don't overextend myself. I think that's something I'm kind of working through my own self, is not overextending myself and thinking about what are the ways that I can give myself the resources that I need to be well in this work.
I love that, Derek. Thank you so much. What a beautiful summary and reflection of all the different ways that we can try to help our staff look at the different resources and supports that they have outside of just us, right? As an individual who cares about them, or as a manager or leader within their organization, but also the piece around self-accountability, right? And building the support and the skills for that, and belief in folks that they can grow their capacity for self-accountability. And then, yes, looking at ourselves and how can we be in touch with our own needs and have our own healthy boundaries. I think that's such a wise and critical reminder, and one that I'm grateful for you bringing up. It's a good reminder for me in this moment too. So thank you.
Oh,
No, you go ahead, Ian.
Derek, it's such a small community because we've actually done pod mapping before with API Chaya. I think it was Priya. So it's really cool to hear you talk about that. But I think for me, when I think about like balancing that healthy boundary, it really is like, how do we be proactive versus reactive to emerging situations? There is always going to be things that comes up in our work. There's always going to be something that needs to get done or prioritized. And if we're like, along with providing resources for our staff, I think really being strategic in it by like coming up with a list of resources that we can like go to whenever that is needed, and making that a part of our wellness offering. And making sure that those practices are also being modeled in our workplace, so that it's not just within the individual, but we're also holding each other accountable for, say, sometimes like if our co-EDs are like working on weekends, or like doing a little too much outside of work boundaries, to really like remind them that like, yes, we are self-accountable for each other as well as to ourselves, to hold these wellness practices in place and like really do it all together as a collective. And I think like when I think about that question earlier, when you were asking like, how do you define wellness? And I think all of those things are important. And also like, I think part of defining wellness is also embracing a culture of joy at our organization in order for us to be holistic. And I think that's kind of how we're able to like set those healthy boundaries, and also create room for having fun together, creating moments of celebration, as well as we have mandatory fun times. So it's really funny to say out loud, but I think it's a way for us to reconnect with each other and check in, not just like from manager to supervisor, or supervisor to the team, but as a whole collective group. And for me, I know that I can't be everywhere at once, so I'm not going to be able to like support every individual that is at the organization or like within my community. And I think part of it is really preparing the folks who are in immediate contact with them. So like whether that's like their supervisors or their team members, to really like think about or like to like hold each other accountable. So like training our supervisors to on how to address the situations and how to share these resources and how to coach the people that is on their team, so that they can like so that it's like a something that is spaced out within the organization and not just like held within like a department or a team.
Thank you, Ian. Jody?
So this is an interesting question that I've thought about a lot. I think there's a balance between, as you said, Sarah, when you structured the question, around not being everything to this individual to solve all of their problems around stress or whatever challenges they might be having, that we all are experiencing from the trauma from the work, from the trauma from our own generational background, all of that. So there's this feeling of wanting to, I mean, my staff would often talk about, you know, we come as a whole person to this job. And I think that that is true. I think there's some foundational pieces that we want to keep in place in terms of a philosophy around wellness, around healing, and then building out policies that are consistent with those values. I do think I see it when I was an ED and sort of like the manager person, of also having work that needed to get done to meet deadlines, et cetera, all of those kinds of things. There is also like, I wanted to create a space that people could come as a whole working person, right? Like they come to this job because they want to work and do this work, or we all do for whatever reasons. And that work also needs to get done. Now, it doesn't mean that we have to, but we have to create a culture where we hold ourselves accountable for unnecessary stress, like not wanting to do white supremacist sense of urgency, white supremacist practices that are not necessary, that just suck the life out of us, right? Like we don't want to have this false sense of urgency. We don't want to have perfectionism, all of those sorts of things. So it's it's multi-layered and relatively complex, in that you want people to be able to be themselves, to be their authentic selves, but also be able to do the work, and creating a structure that supports all of that, that values the people as human beings with real crap that happens in all of our lives. And being able to be flexible and supportive in that sense. And also, we are an organization with this particular mission that we're doing this incredibly important work. And so balancing all of that, I think you can do it, but I do think it requires a balance and a naming of the tensions on both sides. And I do think that we are in a place now, a lot of us on this call and in our organizations, where we're become much more aware of white supremacist, white dominant culture practices that have really drained us, and that we bought into. And I will say, just from my own journey, it took me a long time to really undo that practice inside of me. And I will hold myself to a different standard as the executive director or the manager. And in the sense that I might work more hours than I would want my staff to work and not hold myself accountable. And there's all kinds of weird dynamics that happens when you don't live your values, right? Like, because I'm now not modeling it. And then there's a sub message that as the manager, as the ED, I'm working this hard, but I don't want you guys to. But then is there a weirdness that I'm allowing myself to do this? And also, is there's like some judgment there that I'm like, yeah, you guys, I'm going to have to pick up the slack because we have these deadlines, but I don't want you to, like there's all these weird power dynamics and stuff. And I think it took me a while to to be cognizant of all of that, to hold myself accountable to all of that. And it actually honestly took me to go on sabbatical to reflect for 3 months on those types of practices, and really think about how do I really live those values of wanting to support my staff and also getting the work done in a humane way. And I think that means building structures, policies that everybody can rely on, that promote not overworking, not having the sense of urgency, having rest time, having people take their vacation time, all of those kinds of things, and supporting, and the joy also, naming that, and having flexibility. So when something really devastating happens, which we had in 2020, taking a look at our policies and thinking, how can we make some adjustments to really support the staff in this extraordinary moment? So it's complicated and it is a constant balancing act. But overall, I think thinking for me, it was, this is a place that we all come to do this particular work, this mission work. And we are accountable to the community to do that work. So that work has to get done, and pretty much everybody there is there because they love the work and they believe in that mission. So the work gets done. And also we have to balance that with the pull to do overdo, to get sucked into the white supremacist. And also, yeah, so just recognizing it's a complicated and multi-layered, and we all bring our own stuff, and also having flexibility. So it's not a clean answer.
I think because it's not a clean or simple conversation, right? And I just want to recognize, like, out of all the questions that I was prepping and excited for today, this was frankly probably one of the questions I was most excited and wanting to dig into, and also nervous about, because I think it's a really hard conversation to have, because we worry, right, that in saying that there is a balance to be tried for there, that it may be interpreted as we don't care, right, about our colleagues and friends and fellow community members and all of that. And I do not hear in anything that the three of you said a lack of care to any degree. And in fact, instead, I hear an abundance of care, and not just care for our team members, our staff, and our colleagues, but also, like Derek said, checking in with ourselves, a care for ourselves, and also a care for the members of our community that are not on our staff, right? Like when we talk about, for instance, with API Chaya and serving survivors, yes, many of our staff are survivors, and we are also there serving many, many more people who are survivors who are not on staff, right? There is that community commitment and promise that we made when we came to the organization, right? A mission to uphold, and folks that are needing and relying and depending on these services and supports and the advocacy that we do, all of those things. And so, you know, when we talk about holding power and the power dynamics you were speaking of, Jody, I also think that when we talk about how important it is to share power, there is no sharing power without also sharing responsibility, right? And so much of that is, and this was hard for me as an ED, getting out of the dynamic of trying to protect my staff by taking on more. But in doing that, also denying then their own competency and ability to share in that responsibility, and that they don't need to be saved, right? And you know, Uyung, what you were talking about with the white supremacy piece of it, something that's been really on my mind a lot, and is actually going to be a part of the conversation for COOs end of the year convening on December 14th is around how in recent years in particular, all the different amazing tools and articles that have been around for a long time, like Tema Okun's white supremacy article, right? And the describing certain attributes as a part of white supremacy culture, that when that article was written, it was really meant to more so be a tool for white organizers in mostly BIPOC communities or BIPOC organizing spaces to regulate themselves. And yet it's gone around our community so much that they've been taken out of context, these things, and oftentimes, used and weaponized against people of color, right? And made to conflate like anything that we talk about in terms of um, having rigor or rigor might not be the right word, but like, really making sure that we have a strong analysis and alignment in how we do the work, right? Or really doing our due diligence around learning and improving upon and being strategic about how we mount our campaigns and organize within our community. Talking to our staff or ourselves about following through on our time commitments on things. Like all those things get conflated with being white supremacist, and then the conversation just ends, right? As if there isn't any actual nuance to it, and that actually we do need to be strategic. We do want to have a strong analysis that we continue to educate ourselves and each other on. We do want to have rigor to our work because our community deserves that, right? All these things I think are so much more complex than the simplistic ways that oftentimes they get skewed or intentionally, right, co-opted and subverted by the system to actually, again, weaponize them against us rather than helping to move us towards liberation, right, and more healing. So when you had your hand up, right, was that you? That I saw a hand, like an
Yeah,
emoji.
I was just about to share the exact same thing that you were saying. Like
Oh,
I just also want to clarify that when we talk about white supremacy culture and how it's impacted the way we show up, like it has been weaponized. And I think when we think about the balance between like I think there's a resource that my coworker have shared with me where it's an article and a conversation with Maurice Mitchell on building resilient organizations. And then another one where they are talking about how revolutionary love costs you something. And while acknowledging that we are not going to find revolution in the nonprofit workspace, we also need to take a lot of the principles that are from Black-led organizers and leaders into our work and think about accountability to each other is part of like the collective care that we provide for each other, right? So I think while like when we're talking about collective care, it is about wellness. It is about taking rest, about slowing down. And also part of that is how are we showing up to be accountable to the work that we are upholding ourselves to as well. So I think when white supremacy culture, like when the term and principles have been weaponized is when it is taken into an individualistic approach, right? Like when we think about it in a collective like praxis, like it is more expansive than just like let's work less, so that we can like not have burnout. I think it's so true of how you're sharing that there is more nuance to the conversations around how we are showing up in order to get that work done together.
thank you so much for speaking on that. And I mean, I could engage in this conversation for many hours. And I recognize that we're coming to the close to the end of our time now. And I just want to say to Cetris and Jody, who are still on the call, I want to thank you both for, again, continuing to stay in this conversation with us, and want to spend this last bit of time really hearing any thoughts or questions that are coming up from you. But before we do that, I just also want to recognize that, we had 20, 25 people who registered for this workshop today, and many more who told me that they were interested but just couldn't make it. And I just want to say that when I think about that, it both reminds me of, again, how many competing priorities we have, how pressed we feel for time and energy, and how little permission I think we oftentimes feel to make time for this, right? For this kind of conversation. And so I am both grateful to the folks who were able to show up today, and also am very committed to making sure we continue to share out the recording of this conversation and any resources that any of your organizations might want to share as examples for folks to, think about or look at, and continue to have this this community of practice really together, right? And continuing to grow and support one another in this way. And so with that, Cetris and Jody, I am sorry that on this webinar format, I can't technically, I don't have the technical functionality to unmute you, but I would really love to hear from you. If you could chime in with anything that particularly resonated with you, or a question that you have as you think about your organizations and staff. You're talking permitted. That's what I see in in the Zoom. So actually, if you can unmute and talk, we would really love to hear your voices and your thoughts and questions or experiences that you want to share.
Hi, this is Cetris Tucker with Hip Hop is
Oh,
Green.
Cetris, I'm sorry, I've been saying your name wrong.
No worries. Everyone gets that a little, it's a difficult one. So no worries about that at all. But what I would like to say is I'm just grateful that I was able to attend this panel discussion. It was really helpful for me. It reminded me of when I worked for a labor organization, and our principal officer there had cancer. And although she was type 4 cancer, diagnosed, she was still on picket lines. And her staff was telling her, me included, you need to go home. You need to take care of yourself. You need to take care of yourself. And she just would not do it. She would not take time for herself to take care of herself. And what that did for the rest of the staff was it created an environment where no one took time out for themselves. And what happened was people became very, very, they were overworked. They were overworked, and you're not able to really take care of your members in a way that you should take care of your members when you're overworked. And it was all because of her leadership. She showed us that you have to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, or you weren't committed to the cause. And that was awful. So this whole discussion kind of reminded me of that. And the reason I attended is because I'm in an HR role for Hip Hop is Green. And I wanted to find new ways of helping support staff so they don't get burned out.
I really appreciate that story that you just shared, Cetris. I mean, I just feel the heaviness and heartache of that, and also your commitment to really create and support a different culture. And I'm so glad that, listening to the three amazing leaders and organizations we have here today, hopefully help to inspire some ideas.
It was great. Everything that I heard today was very helpful for me. So I appreciate you all.
Thank you. Jody, anything that you want to share from a supportive community for all and your own experiences?
Hey everybody. Yeah, I've just really appreciated listening in today. I think for us, a supportive community for all serves as the backbone organization for a coalition of human service organizations that are trying to connect folks to resources. And we just see, how hard our partners are working, and, savior complex runs deep. We all want to do the best we can and help people. And we feel really, really compelled and pushed to just keep doing. And so that pausing that y'all were talking about, and modeling for others just feels so important. And so for me, even like I can think about it both within our organization. We just have 2 staff. We're a tiny little team. But then we also have 16 partner organizations. And we have on the agenda for next year through our COO funding to plan 6 different events that center healing and resilience and support those things. And so, it's been a really interesting time just trying to brainstorm and think about what type of events or practices are going to be really supportive of this coalition, recognizing that so often it's hard to carve out time to show up for stuff like this because it gets deprioritized. Like kind of what you were just speaking to, Sarah. So many people signed up for this webinar, and there's been a very small number of us that were able to stay. And so, yeah, so I guess I don't have necessarily a question, but just a reflection and an appreciation for the conversation.
Thank you so much, Jody. I think that it's like you said, right? This is so relevant for organizations and organizers of groups of every size, right? Whether we're talking about our organizations that have 2 staff, but a coalition of 16 partners, right? To organizations that have 30 or 50 staff, like this core piece of what it means to be human doing this work for community, and particularly humans from communities who are deeply impacted by systems of oppression, and structural racism and generational trauma, right? All of those pieces, the pieces of pain and the pieces of joy and resilience. It's so real. And yet, as with grief, so often tucked away into the corner and not given enough oxygen to breathe, and really, time to have the conversation and to lean into supporting one another and thinking about what we can actually not just ideate on, but put into practice, experiment, try, continue to adapt and evolve. The things that I heard the 3 of you shared today, Derek and Jody and Uyang, around, everything from, again, making room for grief, acknowledging loss, and how in sharing space together around that, it transforms it from, isolation and pain in isolation to interconnection. That was just such a profoundly beautiful way of capturing that, Derek. And everything from grief work to somatic work to dance, to just taking a breath together, right? All of those things are so deeply transformative, not just to our organizations, but to our spirit, right? Our individual spirit and our collective spirit. And finding ways and continuing to have, I think, to persevere around how to do that in a healthy and boundaried way as much as possible that honors our own, right, sustainability and needs, and, looks to not trying to be the be all end all for everyone and everything, but helping folks and ourselves map out the village of people and resources, right, that exist out there. And, on that note, I do want to say that, with RVC and API Chaya and BIPOC ED Coalition, if there are any of those resources or tools from, examples of policies that you might have mentioned, or lists of practitioners that you may have utilized, like Dr. Leticia Nieto, or, I know that API Chaya has worked with multiple folks, but, anybody there, RVC, any folks you're working with, I think any of those resources that any of your organizations might be willing to share for folks to be able to also get connected to or inspire things that they may be able to implement within their own organizations would be a wonderful way of us continuing to grow and create a more permissive, supportive culture, right? That truly does allow time and space and resources for exactly not just the conversation, but the work that we're talking about today. And so with that, I recognize that we're pretty much at time. I want to thank Jody and Derek and Uyung for being our incredible panelists today, and most of all for the incredible people and leaders you are in community. I personally have so much deep admiration and respect and care for each of you, and I'm so grateful that you are willing to share not just your expertise and your time and your energy today, but also your vulnerabilities and your genuine commitment to continuing to persevere and wrestle with these complex and ever important issues that are so key to upholding our collective well-being and creating a community that truly is both just and loving. So thank you so much. I look forward to continuing this conversation in more ways and spaces and with more people. But until then, I really send you all my gratitude and hope that everyone on this call can go into the rest of your day and evening taking care of yourself and checking in with what you need to be well, and knowing that in doing that, you're also supporting the rest of our community.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for
Thank you,
having us.
everybody.
Thanks so much.